June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, the moment that signaled the beginning of Nazi Germany's end. A triumph of courage and sacrifice that turned World War II's tide. But history balances on a knife's edge. General Eisenhower, aware of the immense risks, drafted a communiqué for disaster, ready to bear all blame. Our landings have failed. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. What if that stark letter had become the day's grim headline? What if Normandy's beaches became mass graveyards for Allied dreams, not pathways to liberation? Picture it. June 6th dawns not with victory, but an Allied catastrophe. Thousands dead, tens of thousands captured, an invasion force decimated against Hitler's Atlantic Wall. This isn't just one battle lost, it's the prologue to a longer, bloodier war, pushing the world to a darker abyss. This is the nightmare of a failed D-Day. News of a glorious German victory would scream across airwaves. Goebbels' propaganda machine would roar. The Anglo-American plutocrats, hurled back into the sea by the unbreakable will of the German soldier. Imagine staged celebrations in Berlin, Hitler lionized, his power solidified. This propaganda coup would re-energize Germans and steel the Wehrmacht. For the Allies, the shock would be cataclysmic. London and Washington plunged into political crisis. Tens of thousands killed, wounded or captured in hours, a devastating blow. The loss of ships, tanks and aircraft would cripple future offensive plans in Western Europe. Eisenhower's resignation would be certain. President Roosevelt, facing an election, might see public support vanish, potentially changing American leadership at a critical time. Recriminations would be vicious. Failed intelligence, a reckless plan, trust between British and Americans would fracture. Churchill, doubting overlord, might see his influence wane or push harder for Mediterranean strategies. Stunned British and American public morale would plummet. The immense cost in young lives for naught might ignite anti-war sentiments or demands to focus on Japan. Vindicated, Hitler would act decisively. Believing the Atlantic Wall impregnable, he'd reinforce coastal defenses. Crucially, elite panzer divisions, historically bogged down in Normandy, would be free for redeployment, straight to the crumbling Eastern Front. This military defeat would be a huge psychological victory for Nazi Germany, injecting morale into a strained regime and telling subjugated Europeans that liberation was not coming. The English Channel would seem an insurmountable barrier to any future liberation, heralding a longer, bloodier war. While the West reeled, the Eastern Front surged. 16 days after the historical D-Day, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, a colossal offensive against German Army Group Center. Historically, D-Day pinned German forces in France, aiding Bagration's success. But with a failed D-Day, the strategic chessboard changes dramatically. Hitler, exultant, would possess a substantial reserve of perhaps 60 battle-hardened divisions, including elite SS panzers, historically ground down in Normandy. A significant portion would rush east to halt the Soviet steamroller. These forces, emboldened and better equipped, would heavily impede the Soviet advance. Decisive Soviet victories might become protracted, bloody stalemates. Cities and territories would be fiercely contested. The Soviet Union's already astronomical casualties would climb even higher, with battles like Kursk or Stalingrad replaying across Belarus, Poland and the Baltics. This shift would poison Allied relations. Stalin, relentlessly demanding a second front, would likely see Normandy's failure as deliberate Western betrayal or staggering incompetence. He might accuse the West of letting the USSR bleed Germany dry. Lend-Lease aid might continue, but the political atmosphere would be toxic, cooperation replaced by mistrust. Stalin would feel justified in pursuing his post-war agenda more aggressively. The German high command, with fresh reserves, could orchestrate more effective counter-offensives, perhaps temporarily stabilizing collapsing sections of the front. This doesn't mean a German victory in the east, the tide was likely too far gone, but it guarantees a far longer, more savage struggle. Scorched earth tactics would intensify, civilian suffering would increase immeasurably. Liberation by the Red Army would come at an even more horrific price, and Soviet power would loom larger over a shattered Eastern and Central Europe. A failed D-Day would force the Western Allies into an agonizing reappraisal. The Germany First policy would face intense fire. One immediate consequence, an even more ferocious strategic bombing campaign. Air Marshal Harris's belief in area bombing to shatter German morale and industry would gain traction. With a land invasion off the table, Air war might seem the only way to strike the Reich's heartland from the west. More devastating raids on German cities would follow, though historians debate the bombing's ultimate effectiveness in ending the war. Alternative land invasion routes, all difficult, would be re-examined. The Italian campaign, already a slow, costly quagmire, might get renewed focus, perhaps pushing north through the Gothic line into Austria. But the mountainous terrain and heavy defenses meant agonizingly slow progress and a less direct path to Germany's industrial heart. Churchill's idea of invading the Balkans to strike Germany's soft underbelly and get ahead of Soviet advances might resurface. Logistical challenges were enormous, the terrain unforgiving, and Stalin would vehemently oppose a major Western Allied presence there. What about another cross-channel invasion? The Normandy losses in men and equipment would make a similar operation incredibly daunting. It would take many months, even a year or more, to rebuild and retrain. Germany would further fortify its coasts. The psychological barrier for troops would be immense. Would Allied political will endure, especially with the Pacific War against Japan still raging? Public morale in Britain and America would be critical. Shock and grief would morph into grim weariness. War bond drives, rationing and casualty lists would be a daily torment. The Grand Alliance's unity would face its severest test, with Stalin's demands intensifying. The vision of swift victory replaced by an unending war of attrition. This desperation could lead to riskier ventures, or even a drift towards seeking a negotiated peace, though any realistic peace with Hitler was virtually impossible. As 1944 grinds into 1945, a failed D-Day means a far grimmer world. The war in Europe, instead of climaxing, becomes a drawn-out, agonizing struggle. The Allied bombing of Germany would reach unprecedented ferocity. German cities, already battered, would face perhaps another year of raids. Infrastructure destruction would be more complete, civilian casualties soaring, and German society unraveling further. This prolonged war gives Germany more time to develop Wunderwaffen. V1S and V2S could become a more persistent threat to Britain. The most horrifying consequence, the sickening continuation of the Holocaust. Concentration camps like Auschwitz would continue their ghastly work for months, possibly another year or more. Resistance movements in occupied Europe would suffer a devastating blow to morale. But a Wehrmacht not facing imminent collapse in the West could offer a more cohesive, if futile, defense against the Soviets. Far from Europe's battlefields, the Manhattan Project, the Allied effort to develop the atomic bomb, was nearing completion. But if D-Day failed, and Europe's war raged into summer 1945 or beyond, Allied leaders would face a horrifying question: use the atomic bomb against Nazi Germany? Pressure to end the war, with mounting casualties and public weariness, would be immense. President Truman would face an unimaginable decision: targets, industrial centers, key transport hubs, or iconic cities like Berlin for a devastating psychological blow. Using atomic weapons on German cities would cause catastrophic destruction and immense loss of life. However, Hitler's deranged psychology makes this uncertain. Dropping atomic bombs on Germany would have profound geopolitical consequences. The nightmare of a failed D-Day could lead to the even greater nightmare of a nuclearized European war, a horrific end to an already barbaric conflict. How does this more brutal World War II end? Even with a failed D-Day, Nazi Germany's defeat was likely inevitable by mid-1944, given Allied industrial might and the Soviet advance. The question is how, at what additional cost, and with what different post-war outcomes. Scenario A, a later, bloodier Allied invasion. After disaster, Western allies might attempt another major amphibious assault, perhaps not until late 1945 or 1946. Germany would have more time to strengthen defenses. The new invasion, haunted by failure, could cost even more lives. If successful, allies would face a bitter fight into Germany. The war ends later, at a far greater price. Scenario B, Soviet dominance. Without a Western front diverting German divisions, the Red Army bears a greater burden. The Soviet westward advance would be slower and costlier. By 1945, Soviet forces would push deep into Central Europe. Soviet tanks could reach much further west, potentially all of Germany, or even into France. The Iron Curtain falls much further west, reshaping post-war Europe. Scenario C, atomic annihilation. If war dragged into summer 1945, the US would have atomic bombs. Using them on German cities would be a grimly plausible option. Atomic bombs on key German cities might shock the Nazis into collapse, assuming Hitler didn't choose societal self-destruction, a swifter end, but introducing nuclear war to Europe. Regardless of the scenario, Germany would be a wasteland. Prolonged fighting, intensified bombing, and potential atomic use would leave devastation far exceeding our 1945. The death toll across Europe, catastrophically higher. The war, extended by many months, perhaps into 1946 or 1947, means millions more lives lost. The victory would be truly Pyrrhic, the joy of liberation muted by exhaustion and immense additional suffering. The end less triumph, more a collective gasp of relief. A failed D-Day's echoes would reverberate for decades, altering the geopolitical landscape. The most immediate consequence: vastly expanded Soviet influence. If the Red Army was the primary force crushing Nazi Germany, post-war Europe's map would be unrecognizably different. Imagine Soviet domination extending to all of Germany, Austria, Denmark, and parts of the Low Countries or northern Italy. Communist governments, backed by Soviet might, could span much of the continent. The Iron Curtain might stretch along the English Channel, creating a larger, more powerful Soviet bloc. The Cold War would ignite from a more precarious start. A Soviet Union controlling Germany's industrial heartlands would have greater economic and military potential. A smaller Western Europe would face a more direct threat. The US, perhaps more isolationist after a D-Day failure, would confront a more formidable Soviet adversary. NATO, if formed, would be weaker. Political fallout within allied nations would be seismic. In the US, profound political shifts and societal divisions could follow. Public faith in leadership might be irreparably shaken. Britain, exhausted and economically drained, could see its decline as a world power accelerate. Decolonization's timeline might also shift, with Britain and France weakened and a dominant USSR championing anti-colonial movements. Independence could be affected by Cold War. Europe's psychological scars would be deeper. More years of brutal warfare, occupation, and the extended Holocaust would leave an indelible traumatic mark. Reconciliation and rebuilding would be even more challenging. A failed D-Day wouldn't mean a Nazi victory. Germany was already on a path to self-destruction, but it would catastrophically reshape how defeat occurred and who paid the highest price. Our world is a direct consequence of Normandy's hard-won victory. Change that pivotal event, and you unleash consequences leading to a profoundly different, likely more dangerous world. This nightmare scenario reminds us how precariously our present is built on past sacrifices. A failed D-Day is a sobering thought. What would be the most significant consequence? How would our world be different? Share your theories in the comments. If you found this alternate history compelling, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more What If deep dives. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. What historical crossroads should we tackle next? Let us know. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944 were not a guaranteed victory. They were a monumental gamble where millions' fates hung in the balance. Considering a failed D-Day underscores the immense bravery and sacrifice of the Allied soldiers and how critical their success was to our future. While Nazi Germany was on a path to defeat, a Normandy failure would have undeniably prolonged World War II, perhaps by agonizing months or even years. This delay means escalated suffering, countless more lives lost, a more devastating bombing campaign, the unconscionable extension of the Holocaust, and a Europe potentially carved up very differently, likely leading to a far more dominant Soviet Union. The world we know was forged in those pivotal summer days of 1944. Contemplating the nightmare of a different outcome isn't just a historical exercise. It's a humbling reminder of the debt we owe to those who fought and died to prevent that darker timeline. The line between our world and a far more terrible one was, on that June morning, perilously thin. If you enjoy videos on D-Day, check out our last video on D-Day and this playlist on D-Day as well. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay informed and stay curious.